Hello and welcome to this audiovisual presentation. This presentation is going to focus on one of the areas within social psychology, particularly the area where we try to understand how people make sense of all the social information that they receive almost constantly in the social situations they're in. This collectively is known as social cognition, and itself is a pretty broad area, so we're really only going to have time to focus on a few areas within social cognition. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the area of attribution. So how do we use the information about what we know about people and what they're doing to make sense of why they're doing it? And impression formation. How do we build up a more complete image of somebody and who they are and what they're like from the little bits that we know about and the little bits that we learn about them in social situations? Social cognition is really looking at the process of cognition in social situations. Now, cognition is a term we use much more broadly in psychology to describe all of those processes we use to process information. So memory, attention, decision-making, problem-solving, these are all cognitive processes, and we use them to deal with, process, store and retrieve all the information that we encounter in our lives. And really, social cognition is then applying the rules of cognition to the specific information we get from social situations that are relevant to social situations. Now, the reason we need to look at social cognition separately from the rest of sort of regular cognition, if you want to call it that, is because although some of the same processes work for social information as they do for other kinds of information, there are some things that we do to social information that are unique to just social information. Certain processes we use only for social information, and the reason is because social information is very important to us. We need to make very critical decisions based on social information, and also because social information needs to be processed so quickly. Imagine, if you will, walking into a room full of people, one of them walks up to you, extends their hand, offering their hand to you to be shaken. Now, do you shake their hand? You can't spend 5 minutes thinking about it. You need to size them up in a heartbeat. And so for this reason, we've often come up with very specific, very tailored methods of dealing with social information so that we can deal with it more rapidly, and so we can deal with the fact that sometimes we don't have all the information we need to make important social decisions. That person who comes up to offer their hand to be shaken, you may not know much about them, you may not know much more than what they look like. So you often have to fill in the gaps, and so again we do things with social information that is, if not unique to social information, certainly much more common with social information than other kinds, in order to both help us deal with it more efficiently and also bridge the gaps that we might have in what we know. Now, when I say that we need to deal with information more efficiently, what I mean by that is that processing any kind of information requires some of our mental resources. You can almost imagine the mind like a factory with a workforce that can be split up to do various different jobs. And the more tricky the job is, the more people that need to be involved in doing it. Now, obviously, this makes it difficult for us to split our attention between several different things, especially if they're all very tricky, delicate things. Now, we all know that we do this. We can multitask. I know the cartoon shows a woman doing it, but actually anyone can do it. Anyone can multitask. Often we have to. You know, the idea of walking down the street and carrying on a conversation while looking out for the destination that you're going to. Those are three separate things you're doing at the same time. And you really wouldn't be able to function socially if you could only do one of those at any one time. So we all have to split up our cognitive resources between different tasks. Now, once we run out of resources, we can't do any more, or sometimes we don't pay as much attention to a task as we would like because some other task is taking up all of our resources, all of our effort and focus. In order to get around this, we often look at ways of reducing the amount of resources that any one task, any particular task needs, in order to free up those resources to allow us to focus more on other things at the same time, or even take up an entirely new activity simultaneously to what we're already doing. And this is called reducing the cognitive load. The cognitive load is the amount of effort or resources that one particular task is using. And we've got various different ways of doing that. We've got little tricks and techniques that enable us to make rapid decisions without much effort. These are called heuristics. Sometimes certain processes we learn to do them without thinking about them at all. Think of like tying your shoelaces. This is called automaticity. But there are certain kind of rules we use for social information, like schemata and categorization, where we often group things together into categories or groups, because then it allows us to make a rapid decision, not by evaluating an object entirely, but just by deciding, well, which category does it belong to, and how do we deal with things in that category. And that makes a complex decision simple, and that frees up our resources. Now, you have to understand that this thing we do, this way we simplify our decisions in order to make them more rapidly, is entirely necessary. We need to do this because social situations demand we process lots of things simultaneously, and we do it very rapidly. So it's a necessity that we do this, and most of the time it's very beneficial that we do it. It enables us to function well socially. However, occasionally we have to keep an eye out for when all of these kind of shortcuts and tricks and techniques we use might actually lead us in the wrong direction, might lead us to make the wrong conclusions or make the wrong decisions. And in case any of you is wondering or worried or bothered by the fact that it's a woman who's doing this multitasking while driving, don't worry, we'll talk about stereotyping and prejudice a little bit in this session, and maybe in other sessions as well. Let's start with the first example of the first area of social cognition I wanted to look at, which is attribution. How do we make sense of the things people do, and how do we figure out why they're doing them? Let's take an example of this gentleman on the screen here. So you can see him, he's there on his scooter, but he's doing something rather odd. Now I'm limiting what you can see for the moment, but I want you to take a moment to think, why do you think he's doing what he's doing? Try to come up with more than one example if you like. So try to figure out what would make somebody in that situation do what he's doing. I'm going to pause the recording, maybe have a think about it. Okay, so there are a number of possible explanations. He could be, trying to avoid a crash. Maybe there's something we can't see and he's swerving to avoid it. We certainly know that he's doing something odd because we can compare him against other people we know who do that sort of thing, ride a scooter, and we can see, well, that's not how most people ride a scooter, so there's something different about what he does that makes us think there's a unique explanation. And maybe if we could see more of what was going on around him, we might be able to explain it by some sort of environmental situation, swerving to avoid something. Or maybe it's something to do with his personality. Maybe he's, he's just popping a wheelie because he's trying to impress his friends. Hard for us to know, but by looking around him at what he's doing, by looking at what else is going on around him, by comparing him against other people that we know who do things like that, and by that I mean ride on a scooter, we can figure out what's likely and what's unlikely to be the explanation for his behaviour. Let's see if it changes your view at all if I show you more of the picture. Now you can see more of the picture. Has your opinion of why he's doing it changed? Well, it's likely that you're going to start to draw slightly different conclusions now, probably jumping to a conclusion about the woman and her relevance and how his behaviour might be explained by her. So I've presented this in a lot of sessions, and there's quite a lot of students who think that somehow he's trying to show off to her. I think I had one student who once suggested he was actually trying to kill her. But whatever you might be thinking, it's likely that even if you don't think it's the woman, you've certainly had to consider the woman for a moment to consider, is she part of the picture in terms of explaining his behaviour? And this is what we do. We look at not just what the person is doing, but what's going on around him in order to make sense of why he's doing what he's doing. And this process that I'm describing to you now, that you're doing now, looking at this picture, is called attribution. And that's what attribution is. It's how we, if you like, read people's minds, you might call it. I know psychologists are always accused of, sometimes jokingly, of reading the minds of other people, but in truth, everybody tries to read the minds of those around them in order to make sense of their behaviour. Otherwise, think of how confusing the world would be that we live in, if we didn't understand why anybody did what they did. We're constantly faced with people's behaviour, and we're constantly needing to understand that behaviour in order to make sense of it, in order to know how we should respond to it. Now, psychology simply gives a name to this and calls it attribution. We can even apply this to ourselves sometimes. Now, you might think it odd that we have to understand our own behaviour. Surely we know why we do what we do, but in truth, sometimes we don't, or sometimes we need to figure out why we've done what we've done after the fact. But most of the time, attribution is applied to other people. We try to understand why they're doing what they're doing. Now, one of the earliest theories on this is Hyder's theory, and it's sometimes called the naive psychologist or the naive scientist. But fundamentally what it's saying is that everybody tries to understand those around them in much the way that a psychologist or a scientist does, that they look at the evidence and they try to form conclusions, theories, hypotheses, whatever you want to call them, based on that evidence. And he calls them naive because they're doing it based on just common sense rather than any kind of systematic or scientific method. But in truth, Haider, I think, captures it pretty well. So what he says effectively is that when we try to understand people, why they do what they do, we look at two things. We look firstly at a possible personal attribution. Are they doing it because of who they are? Something to do with their personality, their background, their style or way of doing things, their agenda, their desires. Is that the main reason? Or we ultimately go to the other side and say, well, is it mainly to do with their situation, that they're doing what they're doing because of what's going on around them? So it's either a personal attribution, meaning they're doing it because of who they are, what sort of person they are, or it's situational, where they're doing it mainly because of the situation they're in. Now, Haider doesn't necessarily say that it has to be entirely personal or entirely situational. There can be a mixture of both. But what he's suggesting is that most of the time we tend to favour one explanation or the other. We really see it as a complete 50-50 mix of both. However, Haider's original theory doesn't give us a method or doesn't explain our method of deciding if it's personal or situational. It simply says that when we come to try and understand the behaviour of others, we either go for a personal explanation or a situational one. But other researchers then followed on Haider's theory in order to explain how it is we make that distinction. How do we decide if it's personal? How do we decide if it's situational? And we'll look at some of those now. Let's use another example to sort of tease out the methods by which we make these decisions about whether or not we explain people's behaviour primarily as being down to their personality or down to the situation they were in. And to do that, let's use a real life example rather than a completely hypothetical one. You may or may not recognise the images on the screen here, but if you know anything about football, or if you're at all interested in sort of the more outrageous behaviour of footballers, even maybe you're just interested in the gossip and not the game, you'll probably have heard of this one. If not, let me introduce you to Luis Suarez, seen by many as a very talented player but also a very controversial one. And one of the reasons he's so controversial is that on 3 very notable occasions he was in some way punished or sort of penalised for biting other people on the football pitch. Now, it's a rather unusual thing. Football is not usually a contact sport, let alone some sort of combat, but Suarez has on more than one occasion been accused of biting people, and he generally has acknowledged that yes, he did it. So the question becomes, why do you think he did it? Why on earth would anybody do it, or why on earth would any football player do it? Now, if you may already have your personal opinions on this one, in which case you can just skip over the pause and go straight to sort of us discussing it. Or if you haven't encountered this before, just pause the recording for a moment and think about it. Why on earth would someone do this? So pause the recording, have a think, see if you can come up with any explanations about why anyone might do this. Now, a few things before we kind of go on to sort of break down Suarez's behaviour. It's interesting to see what's been written about this, and one or two things. I mean, Suarez has written a book and he talks about these incidents, and he personally doesn't think they're that serious. He thinks that they're kind of he talks about his adrenaline levels in the game, you know, that he just gets so worked up that he has to release the tension almost, and he does it by doing something outrageous. And so that's what, sometimes it's frustration, the game's going badly, sometimes it's just a high pressure situation. He sees it as him just slightly losing control but blowing off steam mainly. It's interesting though that he also says in one part of his book, I haven't read the book, I've read excerpts of it, he says that when his wife saw the footage, she kind of challenged him and said, what on earth are you doing? And that he actually had to think about it, he wasn't sure. And this is what I mean about attribution. We sometimes, even we ourselves, aren't sure why we do what we do immediately. We sometimes make sense of it after the fact. So as far as Suarez is concerned, he does it as a way to sort of blow off steam because things are going badly, or it all becomes too much to him. And in that sense, he would put it down to the situation he was in. But it's not him personally, it's just all the tension and whatever. But would you agree? Well, you might ask yourself, well, hold on a minute. Aren't lots of footballers experiencing this tension? Do they all go around biting people? And the answer is no, they don't. And also, we might ask, well, hold on a minute, this wasn't just once off, he's done this several times. So maybe it's not just the situation, maybe there's something about him that makes him do this. Maybe he's bad at handling tension, maybe he's more aggressive than other players are. But those qualities, we look at what's going on around him, but also what do other people do in similar situations, and what does he do in other situations? Is it a one-off, or does he do it many times? These are the clues we often use to make that decision between whether or not we think it's his situation he's in, or whether or not we think it's him as a person. So let's break those down to look at them more specifically. Now, there are two theories, very similar theories actually, which both try to explain this process of breaking down the social situation, what's going on, in order to decide if we think someone's behaviour is primarily down to their situation or their personality. They use slightly different terms to explain how we do it, but when you see them both, you'll see they're actually both talking about roughly the same thing. Correspondence inference theory is the first one by Jones and Davis, and effectively what they say is that we look at three things. We look at how much choice we think they had, we look at how expected their behaviour is, and we look at something called non-common effects. So choice is, well, how much choice do we think they had in the matter? Could they have not done it if they didn't want to? Were they forced to do it, I guess, is choice. Secondly, we look at expectedness. Do other people behave the same way in the same situation? And thirdly, we look at what are called non-common effects. Is there something about what they did that would be unique, that produces a unique result? Or could they have produced similar results by other behaviours? Now, if there's something different about what they did, if it produced a unique effect that other similar behaviours wouldn't have produced, that's a non-common effect, something that behaviour does that no other behaviour would have achieved. And that tells us something about why they did it. So let's look at Suarez's behaviour in those terms. Well, choice, did he have a choice? I'd say most people would say yes, he did have a choice. He didn't have to bite these people. In terms of expectedness, well, do other football players bite other players in tense situations? The answer is no. Now, the answer to both of those would suggest that it's a personal decision rather than the situation he was in. The fact that he had a choice, the fact that most other people don't do the same thing. Now, in terms of non-common effects, Suarez's own explanation is that he's trying to blow off steam. Well, we could argue that there are many ways you could blow off steam. That you could swear, you could basically kick something. These are footballers. There's bound to be something around they can kick, or you could just wait till you go home and do lots of working out. That's people blow off steam that way. So he could have chosen these ways to blow off steam. Other players use those methods of blowing off steam. He didn't. So what did his method of blowing off steam do that the other methods didn't? Well, it probably intimidated the hell out of the player that he was biting. So maybe it's not down to the situation. Maybe that non-common effect of it being a way of blowing off steam that can psych out or intimidate other players, that may be why he did it. And as such, we might then put together the fact that he had a choice, that it's not what most people do, and the fact that his method of blowing off steam produces a unique effect, to use that as our way of figuring out that it's his personality, that it's a personal choice to blow off steam in a way that psychs other players out, maybe because he's so competitive, rather than using another method. So that would be how correspondence inference theory explains our decision to blame Suarez for it and not put it down to his situation. Now, we could look at covariation theory by Kelly, and it does roughly the same thing. Kelly says that we look at consensus, distinctiveness and consistency. Consensus, do lots of others exhibit the same behaviour? Well, that's similar to expectedness. Do other people do this? The answer is no. Distinctiveness, does this individual behave the same way in different situations? Well, generally not. It's something he only does on the football pitch. I've never heard any reports of him biting people off the football pitch. Now, we must get stressed out off the football pitch. It's not the only place in our life we experience stress, so that suggests there's something distinctive about the football pitch and this behaviour. And finally, consistency. Does the person do the behaviour lots of times in this situation? The answer is yes. Okay, it's not every game, but certainly it's been more than just one occasion. That would suggest, those three things, the fact that it's not what other people do, the fact that he only does it on football pitches, and the fact that he's done it many times on football pitches, would suggest that it's something about his personality, although it is recognising something about the situation, that he's not just a biter, he's a biter on football pitches. And again, that would lead us to think that it's about something about a kind of a deliberate act by him. Not necessarily one he fully understands maybe, but something he is choosing to do on a football pitch because it achieves a specific goal for him. Now, you may have come to a different conclusion. Maybe if you're a Suarez fan, you're more willing to try and interpret the facts so as to make it down to his situation. But even if you do, you'll probably be using similar techniques to the ones I'm describing. Maybe saying to yourself, well, lots of other players, lash out, and that's just him lashing out. And when you do things like that, when you say it's not his fault, lots of other players lash out at other people, then you're effectively saying that this is expected behaviour, that effectively it's not a unique behaviour by him, that lots of other people are doing it, a high level of consensus, if you like, a high level of expectedness. And so you're simply interpreting the result differently in order to support maybe the conclusion you want to, but you're still using a similar process, either correspondent inference or covariation. And this is how we do it. This is how we make sense of everybody's behaviour, not just dramatic examples like Suarez, but even everyday things like somebody offering you to make you a cup of tea and you're wondering why they do it. You tend to look at these things. What do you know about them? Do you think they had to make you a cup of tea? Do they offer lots of cups of tea to many other people, or do other people offer you cups of tea? And maybe are they regularly offering you a cup of tea, or are they offering you one today and only today? So maybe is there some particular agenda behind it today? Maybe they want something. This is how we do it. As I said before, processes like attribution are processes we need to use because social situations don't give us all the information we need, and so sometimes we need to fill in the gaps. We need to make decisions and form conclusions based on incomplete evidence, and so we use systems like attribution to help us make sense of it. And although it's absolutely necessary and usually reasonably effective, it's not immune to bias, it's not immune to distortion. Haider thought that we were sort of naive scientists who were rationally and impartially judging the behaviour of others. However, the truth is unfortunately not so nice and neat. Quite often we make very wrong decisions or wrong interpretations because our method of coming to the conclusions is biased. Like I said in the previous example, maybe you like Suarez and so you interpret the evidence in a biased way in order to support what you want to believe. Now, although there are likely to be lots of individual biases in this way that aren't predictable, there are some general biases in our processing of information in terms of attribution, making sense of other people's behaviour, that are fairly common. And I'm listing two of them here on the slide. One of them is called the fundamental attribution error. And essentially what that describes is a very common bias, in fact almost a universal bias, that when we are interpreting the behaviour of others, we tend to be too likely to explain that behaviour as a result of personality. We're biased towards interpreting other people's behaviour as being down to their personality and less likely to be about the situation they're in. But interestingly, when we come to interpret our own behaviour, we often are biased in the other direction and are far more likely to interpret our own behaviour as being a product of the situation and less as a reflection of our personality. Now, if you want an example of that, consider somebody who maybe drives fast, okay? So if you're driving your car and somebody overtakes you at what you consider to be a high speed, why do you think they do it? Chances are you'll think, oh God, look at that, boy racer, idiot, all sorts of nasty words I can't repeat. But chances are you'll blame them for speeding because of who they are, their personality, rather than thinking, gosh, that person is in a really bad situation, needs to get somewhere quickly, has to go fast, you know, the doctor rushing to the patient, last thing you think of. You tend to put it down to their personality. However, when you drive fast, chances are you say to yourself, oh well, I have to, I'm late, and you know, I've got people waiting on me, and this is important, and my job depends on it, my kids need to be collected. You tend to put it down to your situation and excuse yourself, you know. You don't tend to say the things about yourself that you say to the things about the other person. And you don't call it speeding when you're doing it. You say I was driving fast, but you weren't speeding. Speeding is what the other person does, and they do it because they're a boy racer or an idiot. So this is one of the biases. We tend to overestimate how much other people's behaviour is down to their personality, and we tend to overestimate how much our own behaviour is down to the situation. The other bias that creeps in fairly commonly in our attribution, and this is mainly about our own behaviour, particularly about our own successes and failures, is called the self-serving bias. And that is that when we are successful, when things go well, we tend to put the responsibility for it on us as a person and not on our situation or anyone around us. We take credit for our successes. Think about the last time you got a good mark. You probably patted yourself on the back and thought, well, I worked hard for that test. Now, you don't tend to think as quickly, oh, that was an easy question, or the marker was incredibly generous, or maybe I was just lucky. Most of us, the first thought is ourselves. We did well. So we did something right. Must be down to us. Now, interestingly, when we do badly, we fall into the other bias of tending to overlook our own contribution and instead focus on everybody else and everything else around us. So that effectively, when we do badly, we tend to look for blame elsewhere. The question was unfair, the marker doesn't like me, or this subject is rubbish, I do much better in my other subject. That's what a real subject is like. So again, we are more likely to take credit for our successes, and we're more likely to seek external explanations for our failures. We'll come back to this a little bit later on. But try to remember the next time you get a good mark or a bad mark. Try not to pat yourself too hard on the back when you do well, and maybe think twice about looking for scapegoats and blame outside yourself when things don't go as well as they possibly could. The final bias I want to talk about, I need to illustrate with an example before we get on to it. Imagine you're in the post office, you're in a queue, you're not in a rush particularly, and maybe you're sort of about halfway down the queue, and someone sort of taps on your shoulder. It's a man, he seems agitated, he keeps checking his watch, and he's standing behind you in the queue, and he asks if he can kind of skip ahead of you in the queue. Now, the question is, would you let him? First, I want you to make that decision. Don't think too much about it. Instant reaction, would you let him? Okay, now that you've decided what you would do, try to estimate what you think most people would do in that situation. Your sort of average man and woman in the street. Do you think that most people would do what you did? That most wouldn't? What would the majority of people do? Do you think they'd do what you did or something else? Have a think about it. Okay. The chances are that if you ask this question to a large group of people, most people will think that their behaviour is a typical behaviour. So most people believe that whatever they chose to do, that most other people would choose to do it. Now that's interesting. You find this is true for both possible answers. That the people who said, no, I wouldn't let him skip ahead, think that most other people wouldn't let him skip ahead. And the people who would let him skip ahead also think that most other people would let him skip ahead. Ross Green and House did the same kind of study, but asking people if they would walk around their university campus wearing a sort of sandwich board advertising some product. And based on whether they said yes or no, whether they said or yes or no, they then asked them what they thought most other people would do, and they found that again, the students believed that most people would do whatever they chose to do. So if they said no, I don't want to do it, they believe most of the people would believe that. If they said yes, they would do it, they believe most of the people would also say yes. And this is known as the false consensus effect. We tend to overestimate how many other people would do the same things as we do in the same situation. So we tend to use our behaviour more than we should as a kind of a yardstick for what typical behaviour is. Now remember what I said earlier, that often when we're trying to attribute the behaviour of other people, we often ask ourselves, would most people do what they have done? Now think about it. If this person that we're looking at has done what we've done, then we would be more likely to think, yeah, most people would do that, because that's what we think of our behaviour. We think most people would do it. But we're distorting. It's not actually true that most people would do what we do, and therefore just because they did what we did doesn't make their behaviour typical. Similarly, if we're observing somebody and they do something that we would never do, because of this bias, false consensus, we're likely to fall into the trap of thinking, God, that behaviour is weird, that's not typical at all. Why do we think it's not typical? Because we wouldn't do it. And again, we always consider our behaviour to be the best example of typical behaviour. So essentially, it's probably one of the reasons we're likely to sort of put the responsibility for behaviour that's different from ours on the person, on their personality, because we see the behaviour as not typical, because it's not like our behaviour, and our behaviour in our mind is the example of typical behaviour always. And on the other hand, if somebody does what we do, we're more likely to maybe put it down to the situation, because again, we assume, oh look, well, most people would do that. Why do we think it? Because that's what we would do. And again, we use our own behaviour as our yardstick for typical behaviour. So this bias, the false consensus effect, causes us to have flaws in our judgment of other people's behaviour and whether or not we think it's typical, and thus whether or not we think it's down to their personality or down to the situation. Hopefully this is all giving you a lot of food for thought about how you make sense of the behaviour of those around you and how you judge them and what your reasoning is for judging them the way you do, or even how you judge yourself. But it may not have occurred to you how this could be an educational issue yet. I mean, I'm talking about people biting each other on the football pitch, or jumping ahead of each other in postal queues. What has that got to do with education? Well, actually, as an educator, you're quite often attempting to understand the behaviour of your students, understand the behaviour of your clients or your colleagues. And when you do that, attribution plays a big part. Consider, if you will, the two scenarios in front of you. Pause the recording, have a good read of them, and in each case, try to decide for yourself why you think the student is doing what they're doing. So have a pause, have a look at it, have a think about it. Okay, let's start with Kamal. Well, what sort of things did you look at? Did you consider, I mean, there may be things you don't know here that you might want to know in order to make the decision. Is Kamal's behaviour unique or not? Are lots of people doing worse after Christmas, or is it just Kamal? And is he doing worse in just your class, or is he doing worse in lots of other classes? And again, this is the kind of consensus covariation information that the covariation theory and the correspondence inference theory says we use to try and figure out whether what people are doing is down to their situation or down to their personality. And that decision about whether or not you think Kamal's behaviour is down to their situation or down to their personality is going to make a big difference in how you tackle it. So if you think it's down to their personality, you're likely to try and tackle it on a personal level. You're trying to, maybe if you think it's because they're starting to get a bit lazy, you might try to motivate them. Maybe if you think it's because they're upset about something, you might try to counsel them or sort of just help them sort of become happier in your class. However, on the other hand, if you think it's down to their situation, what's going on at home, what's going on, how other people in the class are treating them, you're then going to tackle the situation very differently. So you might start talking to Kamal's parents, or you might start looking at the way other people are treating him in the class. Now, of course, you might do all of these things, but that assumes you've got the luxury of lots of time, and that assumes that you've got sort of a chance to really think about this. Often we have to make decisions very quickly, like I said, in social situations. So if Kamal starts acting up at a class, what do you do right then and there? Do you think of it as Kamal's behaviour, as down to his personal attitude maybe, and punish him? Or do you think of it down to something else and seek to support him, or maybe just ignore them on that particular day. Now similarly, if we look at Deirdre and Aoife, again we might ask some of the same questions, the same attribution questions. We might consider, well, how does each one of them behave when the other one isn't around? How does each one of them behave with other students? Is Deirdre always the most active? Does everybody get more active when Deirdre isn't there, or is it just Aoife? And again, those kind of questions of the distinctiveness and the expectedness and how often they do it, and if they do it in other situations, are the kind of things that you use to make decisions about how you should tackle this issue, whether or not there even is an issue to be tackled. But remember that all the biases I talked about creep in here. So maybe because you're looking at the behaviour of other people, you're going to be more likely to put it down to their personality than their situation, which is the fundamental attribution error. And maybe if their behaviour is very different from how you behaved when you were in similar situations, you might interpret it differently because of false consensus, because you think your behaviour is a good example of typical behaviour by everybody. So being aware of the way in which your attributions can be biased and can be distorted is important if you want to make more objective evaluations of why your students or clients or colleagues do what they do, and use that information to help them, to educate them, to work with them. I've said several times already that although one of the most common way we use attribution is to use it to understand the behaviour of others, it's also quite possible that this is a focus we can turn inwards on ourselves. We call this self-attribution, and that is when we use some of the similar processes that I've described to you already to understand our own behaviour and why we did what we did, or why we do what we do in an ongoing way. I mean, you might think it's odd that we need to do this, that we don't always understand our own behaviour, but the truth is we don't. Our behaviour is a complex thing, and we are often, as I say, dividing our mental resources between doing several different things at the same time. So sometimes our behaviour is something we don't always completely pay attention to. We do things without fully thinking about them, and often it's only when we look back and observe what we've done that we then really give it the full scrutiny and ask, well, why did I do that? And when we do that, we use a similar process to the one I've just been describing to understand the behaviour of others. We turn that inwards and ask, why did this person, the person being ourselves, why did they do what they did? How much of it is personality, how much of it is down to situation, and what are those aspects of our personality that caused this behaviour, and what were the aspects of the situation that caused it? Now if you're trying to sort of get to grips with this idea of understanding yourself in this way, consider the following questions. Why do you do well on certain assignments? Have you ever tried to understand that as a behaviour? Or why do you struggle to learn certain topics or certain areas? Why are some things easier for you to learn than others? Even in a more general way, have you ever considered why on some days you're happy or on other days you're sad? Often we find the mood is there before we realise it, and we have to try and understand it by looking around us, by looking at what's going on in our lives to try and figure out why we feel the way we feel. So you'd be surprised how often we are engaged in self-attribution, trying to understand our own behaviour in this way. But let's see if we can ground this discussion in something much more specific and to do with education. As I've just said, one of the things that you can sometimes find yourself facing is the question of why you're doing well or why you're doing not as well as you would like in a particular subject or in a particular assignment. It's very common that students will get a mark back and they'll look at the mark and be surprised, sometimes in a very positive way, getting the mark is better than they expected, or sometimes in a negative way, they're disappointed. And it's also quite common for students to find that their marks are not very consistent, that in some areas, maybe in certain types of assignments, they do very well, or in certain subjects they do very well, whereas in the other assignments or the other subject they don't do as well. And again, we often struggle to understand this, and we come up with theories, pet theories or personal theories about why it is we do well in some areas and not so well in others. I want you to sort of pause the recording in a minute, and when you do that, I want you to consider some example in your own life that's similar to what I'm describing. An example where you do well in some area but not so well in another. Maybe it's well in certain assignments but not in others, or maybe it's well in one subject area but not so well in the other. I want you to try and understand it, if you haven't already done so. Why do you do well in the one you do well in? And why do you do not so well in the other one? Have you ever tried to understand it? What's the difference, as far as you're concerned, between these two things, whether they're two types of assignments or two subject areas, that results in you doing better in one and not so well in the other? So pause the recording, have a bit of a think about this for just a few minutes, and then when you're ready, we'll start again. Okay, so hopefully at this point you've managed to identify some area or areas where your performance is different, or you sort of get on well in one, not so well in the other. And you've probably come up with a few theories as to why one is your good type of assignment or your good subject, and the other one is your not so good one. Let's explore those in light of particular theories which have been developed to help us understand our thinking in this area. At this point, hopefully you've identified the reasons that explain why you get on better in certain subjects and less so well in others, or get on better at certain assignments and less well in others. Now, before we go any further, let's see if we can break down these reasons that you've identified. And the way we're going to do that is by using a theory developed by Weiner in 1979. And Weiner said that whenever we're trying to understand our own behaviour and the reasons we come up with to explain our behaviour, it's useful to categorise those reasons along three different dimensions. And for each reason you can do this. There are three dimensions that Weiner identified: whether the reason was internal or external, stable or unstable, controllable or uncontrollable. And so for each reason, I want you to look at it and consider, is this reason primarily an internal reason, something within you that's cause and outcome, or is it external, something outside of you, the environment, other people, essentially anything that isn't you? And after you've identified it as internal or external, the next question is, for each reason, is it a stable or unstable event? Is it something that happens all the time, or something that just happens occasionally? Is it predictable or unpredictable? Can you know it's going to happen, or is it somewhat random? And lastly, is it controllable or uncontrollable? Is it, whatever the reason is it something that you have any or anyone has any direct control over, or is it sort of something that's outside your control or outside anybody's control? So for each of the reasons you've identified, classify them in this way on all three dimensions: internal or external, stable or unstable, controllable or uncontrollable. So you might say, for example, that if one of the reasons you think that you get on better in certain subjects is because the people teaching those subjects are more enthusiastic, you might say that that was an external factor, that if they're always enthusiastic, this is a stable thing, and that effectively it's uncontrollable by you. So controllable or uncontrollable is really whether you control it or not. And so I guess the enthusiasm of the people teaching you is not within your direct control. Okay, so that would be how you would classify that one example. So do this for all of the reasons you've come up with. Now, you may be thinking for some of the reasons, oh, well, it's a bit internal, it's a bit external, fair enough, but it's rare that it'll be completely 50-50, equally both. So I guess for any one of those, which one is more the better descriptor of the two? Is it mostly internal? Is it mostly external? Is it mostly controllable? Mostly uncontrollable? So, come down off the fence. Now, the interesting thing is that Weiner believed that essentially we tend to have a pattern in the way that we justify our behaviour or explain our behaviour. That really, what you should find, and it may only emerge if you did this for enough behaviours and enough reasons for those behaviours, is that certain patterns would emerge, that you'd tend to describe the reasons for your behaviour using similar categories more often than not. So that maybe you'll find that most of the time you're talking about external, uncontrollable events as the major reasons to explain your behaviour. And again, this pattern may not emerge in the few reasons you're looking at now, but they probably would emerge if we looked at enough reasons and enough behaviours. And this sort of attributional style is a habit you've fallen into, a way of explaining your life to yourself. Be interesting to see if you already spot a pattern in the few reasons you're looking at, but if not, maybe something you need to sit back and reflect on a bit more, asking yourself, well, in general, how do I explain my successes and failures? Is there a sort of a typical way I tend to explain them? Of course, you may be wondering, why does it matter how you explain your own behaviour? What does it matter which of the where your reasons fall on these various dimensions that Weiner has identified? Well, I'll explain to you now how it matters. Before we get on to why it matters, one other thing to consider is whether or not your explanations for your own behaviour may contain certain biases. I talked about biases in attribution earlier. So, for example, if you both came up with reasons why you do better and why other times you do worse, look at those two types of reasons. Are the reasons why you do better mostly focusing on internal factors within yourself? And are the reasons why you do worse or don't enjoy it as much or don't get on as well mostly focusing on external reasons? If you can see that pattern, this is the self-serving bias I talked about earlier, that we tend to take credit for our successes, internal factors, things we do, and we tend to place the responsibility for our failures outside of ourselves, external factors, uncontrollable factors. External and uncontrollable factors are the ones we have the least responsibility for, and so it gives us the least amount of blame for those reasons if they're the reasons why things go wrong or don't work out the way that they should. Another potential bias that might creep in is to ask yourself, for those reasons you identify which are external to yourself, how do you know those are really the reasons why you don't do as well, or you don't enjoy something as well, or don't get on as well in a certain subject or with a certain kind of assessment? How do you know they're true? I would guess that for some of you, the reason that you have to believe they're true is that you think that everybody else agrees, that you may have even talked to a few people and have built up this impression that, yeah, everybody thinks that this is true. Everybody thinks that these kinds of assignments are harder. Everybody thinks that this subject is less interesting. And what you're probably falling foul of there is false consensus. Remember, we often think that our own beliefs are much more representative of the wider population than they really are. You've probably only talked to a few people, if anyone at all. For a lot of people, they just assume other people agree with them. Or if they've talked to one or two people, they assume that then represents the majority. So it could well be that your attributions for your own behaviour are falling foul of these biases, just in the same way as I said your attributions for other people's behaviour could do that. It may also be worth considering where, if you've started to identify an attributional style, you might want to wonder where that style came from. Is this something down to your personality? Are there other personality factors which lead you to attribute your own behaviour and maybe behaviour of others in a particular way more often than not? Or is it experience? Have you, through your experiences, been shaped into viewing the world in a certain way and believing that this is the way the world works, and therefore seeking to explain your behaviour and the behaviour of others in a way that's consistent with your worldview? But as I said a moment ago, I want to look at why this matters. Why does it matter what your attributional style is for your own behaviour? Why does it matter if you primarily find explanations that are internal or primarily find explanations that are external? Well, let's look at that now. The reason why it's important how each of us attributes our own behaviour, our own successes or failures, is that attribution can have a major impact on how we then respond to those successes and failures. if the attributions you're identifying, either for your success or your failure, are primarily external factors or uncontrollable factors, it can lead you to become passive in the face of challenges. That effectively, if you think success or failure is down to things outside of your own control, outside of you, then you don't tend to take much sort of positive action to do anything to affect the outcome. How could you if you believe the outcome is outside your direct control, is outside of you? And this is one of the problems that as educators we often encounter in those that we teach, that if they don't believe that they're in control of their learning, they don't believe that they're in control of the outcomes, then they become passive and sort of rely on us or rely on someone else or something else to determine the outcome, or simply don't rely on anything at all and sort of operate on a kind of superstition and luck that it'll all work out. Whereas those people who attribute their successes and failures to internal factors are more likely to take the initiative and do something in the face of both success and failure. There's a parallel here with a phenomenon that Pavlov described in his studies of the behaviour of dogs, that if the dogs think they can't avoid the punishment, because he used both rewards and punishments, if they can't avoid the punishment, they become passive, and he called this learned helplessness. They stop trying to avoid it. And I think students can end up like that as well. If they think that failing the exam is something they can't control, they become kind of fatalistic about it and stop really trying. I think the other problem Weiner himself identified later on is that we tend to use these attributions as a way of judging how responsible we are for the outcome. So if we identify factors that are mostly external and uncontrollable, we tend to then let ourselves off the hook and say, well, I'm not responsible for what happened here. And obviously, if you don't think you're responsible, you don't feel any sort of onus on you to actually do something about it. Students that don't take responsibility for their learning become, as I say, passive and essentially sort of in some cases fatalistic. They assume that there's nothing they can do, so they stop trying. Now, I think that it's easy to say that there must be some external factors, that I can't take internal controllable responsibility for everything that happens in my learning. There must be some things that are outside my control. And I would agree that yes, there will exist factors outside your control and factors outside of you which affect your learning. However, maybe it's not a question of whether or not these things exist, but whether or not you give them the majority of the responsibility for the outcome. That there's no problem in acknowledging there are some things outside your control, that's fairly healthy, but you should be focusing on those things that are inside of you and inside your control, even if they're outside of you, that they're things you can control, because that kind of focus will lead you into a positive mode of learning. And again, when it comes to our role as educators, that's the kind of mode of learning we want to encourage in others. We want them to stop focusing on the factors that are external to them or focusing on the factors that are outside of their control. That simply, if they are external and uncontrollable, that worrying about them or focusing on them is a waste of time. And instead, we should be encouraging our students as much as possible to focus on internal factors and factors that are inside their control. Better to strike a light than to curse the darkness, as the saying goes. We want to be getting our learners focusing on what they can do instead of worrying about what they can't. Let's just recap for a moment then. What have we learned so far? Well, so far we've been focusing on the way in which we make sense of the behaviour of others and our own behaviour, which is attribution. And we've learned that attribution is something we all do, not just limited to psychologists, and that we even have a similar method for doing it. Different people tend to approach explaining the behaviour of others and their own behaviour in a certain way, certain patterns, certain methods of doing it. We need to be conscious that our method of making sense of the behaviour of others, although it's absolutely necessary and reasonably reliable, it is vulnerable to certain biases, which can cause us to misattribute behaviour or to distort our explanations for behaviour, others' behaviour and our own, when certain things occur or in certain ways, such as taking credit for our successes but blaming our failures on others. And lastly, just recently we've seen that we tend to have an attribution style or pattern of our own, that we tend to fall into certain habits in terms of the way that the explanations we come up with for our own behaviour and for the behaviour of others. And that we should be aware of these patterns as learners, and we should be sort of alert to these patterns in others as educators, and be aware that certain patterns, those that focus on explanations which are external and uncontrollable, are unhealthy patterns in terms of learning and should be discouraged or scrutinised, brought to conscious awareness so that we can tackle them, or we can help others to tackle their patterns which are sort of ineffective or unhealthy in this way. We're getting most of the way through this presentation. I would say we're about half or 2/3 of the way through now. If you want to take a short break, pause the recording, or finish it up for today and come back to it again tomorrow. The next section we're now going to move on to is looking at the other area of social cognition, which is impression formation. Before we get to grips with the next topic we're going to look at, let's try another exercise. This time I'm going to be asking you to consider a number of social scenarios and what would you do. They're similar in many ways, but there are differences, and I want you to think about each one separately. Here's the first scenario you can see on the screen now. This gentleman comes up, asks you to borrow his phone, borrow your phone rather, so he can call home because his own phone has been lost or stolen. Would you lend your phone to him so he can make the call? Don't think too much about this. What's your gut instinct? What's your gut reaction? Would you do it? Would you not do it? Yes or no? Now, after you've decided which it is, think for a moment. You might want to pause the recording about why you've reacted the way you have. Why would you do it, or why would you not do it? What's your reason? And don't go for the first reason that pops into your head. Maybe think about it a bit harder to consider, is that the real reason why you're doing it or not doing it? When you're ready, we'll move on to the next slide. Scenario number 2. Similar request, although not exactly the same, and a different gentleman. Again, instant reaction. What are you going to do? Are you going to let him, not let him? And again, consider why you're responding this, but in this way. But obviously, you should also consider, has your response been any different from the previous one? If it's the same, were you as quick to make the same response this time around than you were last time? Quicker, less quick? Is there any differences, even if it's the same response, and how easy you found it to make the decision this time compared to last time? And again, consider why there might be reasons for any differences you can find. Pause the recording if you need to, just to give yourself a bit of time to think about it, and then we'll move on. Scenario number 3. Different request this time. Well, not a request, I guess, this time, but different query. These are people who want to talk to you for some reason, beckoned you over. Are you going to cross the road to chat to them? Yes or no? And again, like last time, go for your first response. What is it? What's your immediate instinct on this one? And then pause the recording to think about why you would make that response. What is it that's sort of guiding your action? Pause it when you're ready. We'll move on to the next slide. This is the last of the 4 scenarios. Scenario 4, it's similar to the previous one in terms of it's people who are sort of beckoning you over, want to talk to you for some reason, but different people this time. And again, what would you do? Go with your instinct. What's your first response? And as with the last time, compare your response this time to the previous one. Did you respond the same way? Did you respond differently? Even if you made the same choice, did you make it any quicker or for different reasons this time around compared to the last time around? So again, analyze and reflect on your decisions here. Why are you making the decisions you are? This is attribution again in some way, but we'll be looking at something other than attribution in terms of analysing your behaviour this time around. But again, why did you make the decisions you're making? What's influencing it? When you've had a chance to think about it, we'll move on to the next slide. Now, what I've been asking you to do in these activities, you could say it's another example of attribution. I'm asking you, what's your response? And I'm asking you then to reflect on your behaviour, self-attribution. Why are you making the response that you're making? But I don't want to focus on the attribution issue this time around. I want to focus on specifically what was it about the people that made you react the way that you did. Can were you able to put it into words almost? Could you explain it to yourself about what was it that about them that made you decide the way you decided, or that made it easier or harder for you to decide the decision you made? I mean, when you think about it, you know practically nothing about any of these people. All you got from me was just a brief picture, sometimes not even a full picture of them, but just part of them, you know. And yet, based on that tiny amount of information, you often were able to make a fairly important decision about what you'll do or not do. And I'd be surprised if your judgment about them extended beyond simply how they looked and was based on certain assumptions, certain conclusions you'd made about what sort of people they were, maybe what their personality was like, what their behaviour was likely to be, even what sort of person they are in their general life, how they generally behave, whether they're trustworthy or untrustworthy, nice or not nice. Now, we do this so effortlessly and we do it so constantly throughout our life and throughout our day-to-day that we often don't reflect on what a strange and miraculous ability this is. How is it that when we meet people for the first time we know anything about them? Think about it, when you meet people for the first time, what is it that you notice about them? What sticks in your mind, and why do you think that those things are the things that attract your attention? You may want to pause the recording for a moment and consider having had a memorable first encounter with somebody. What was it that made it so memorable? What made that person stick out in your memory? You may even consider for your own self, what first impressions do you make on other people? What do you think they first notice about you? We know, or at least we believe at some level, that first impressions make a big deal, are a big deal, make a big impression. And as we'll see in a few minutes, that's quite true. But what is it that we notice, and how do we turn the little things we notice, the little scraps of information that we figure out just by looking at someone or in those first early conversations we have about them, how do we take all those fragments and build it into a more complete picture? Another thing to consider is when it comes to judging people in this way, because effectively that's what we're doing. When we build a picture of them, it's not a neutral thing. We're trying to judge their character, figure out if they're a good person or a bad person, if we like them or don't like them. Would you say you're good at this? Are you a good judge of character? Do you find you can suss people out to sort of make a good call about what sort of person they are fairly quickly? And do you find that you're generally right? Are your first impressions generally reliable? I mean, if you want to judge that for yourself, ask how often has it been that you've made a strong first impression that's been completely wrong? You may have done it memorably once or twice, but most of the time we tend to find that our first impressions are the right ones, or at least most of us do. So how do we do it? How do we turn fragments into an overall impression? Well, this is done through processes that we call impression formation. And there's a number of theories about how we do this, so let's look at those next. To illustrate how you form impressions of people, I want you to meet a hypothetical person. I've called him Alex, and you can see on the screen some basic facts about Alex, what sort of person he is. Have a quick read through them and then make a fairly rapid decision about whether or not you like Alex. Is Alex somebody that you would want to be friends with? Again, don't overthink it too much, just read the description and then make a call, one way or the other. If Alex friended you on Facebook, would you friend him back? When you've made that decision, we'll move on to the next slide to look at what it was that helped you make the decision. There are a number of theories out there which explain how we turn all of the fragments of information that we know about somebody, or some of the ones that we simply assume are true, into an overall impression. This is called impression formation. The best known, one of the earliest ones, was called cognitive algebra, developed by Anderson. And what Anderson essentially described as a process by which we sort of list all of the good things we know about them in one category, and list all the bad things we know about them in a second category, and then a bit like bookkeeping, we balance the books and we decide if they end up with in the black with lots of positive things, more positive than negative, or do they end up in the red with more negative things than positive. And this adding up effectively is how we turn the individual fragments into an overall impression, good or bad. Now, you might want to go back to the previous slide and ask yourself, did Alex have more positive traits than negative ones? And if it's the number of positive traits that made you like him, or if you didn't like him, was it because he had more negative ones than positive ones? It's not always clear what is going to be a positive or negative one for everybody. For example, you might consider someone who is sort of intelligent to be something that you're not so keen on. To you, intelligence might be the same thing as being a bit of a know-it-all. So maybe you'd have that in the negative list, but generally speaking, there's usually fairly common agreement on what are positive traits and negative ones. The other thing to consider is whether or not all the traits are equally weighted. Might it be that there are some traits which carry much more weight than others, and so sort of affect the algebra, affect the adding up by making that worth more on the plus side or worth more on the negative side, even if it's only one thing compared to several things on the other side. Of course, not everybody agrees that we figure out people in this kind of rational, organised way. An alternative to the cognitive algebra explanation is what's called the configural model by Ash. And Ash said that instead of sort of doing it in this rational, almost computer-like way, that instead what we do is we skim through everything we know about somebody until we identify something that we think is really important. And we kind of focus on this thing. It becomes a central trait for that individual, really defines them. And then once we have this core impression of them, we then interpret everything else we know about them in light of this core impression. So for example, if the first thing that jumped off the page at you was that Alex is critical, it might then cause you to see other things in a different light. It might then cause you to see intelligent as being more of a negative thing, more cold and analytical, rather than sort of clever. On the other hand, if the first thing you hit upon was that Alex was warm, then you might even see other things like impulsivity as a positive thing, that Alex is. You might see impulsivity and think generosity, someone who just helps others without thinking. So that's what the configural model believes we do. We skim through until we find something important that we think is a real central trait, something that really defines them. And that central trait then causes us to interpret everything else we know about them in light of that main thing. In some ways we're still adding up all the things we know about them, but we're not evaluating those things in a sort of an objective manner. The first thing we picked on, the one that we think is a central issue to describe this person, colours everything we believe we find out about them after that point. So that's the difference between the two approaches. Of course, both of these approaches still work on the idea that we are being relatively impartial, although the configural model does allow for the idea that the central trait can affect our judgment. There's still a belief that we're judging things accurately in some way, that when the things we notice about somebody are the things that are actually true about them, and that we're not being biased or distorted in any way. But it shouldn't surprise you too much to know that there are biases in the way we form impressions, just as there were biases in the way that we make attributions. So let's look at what those biases can be. One of the first things that I guess anybody would be able to guess at as being a potential bias in the way we form impressions is the idea that first impressions carry way more weight than they should. This is sometimes known as the primacy effect, that the first thing or things you learn about somebody tend to carry far more weight than later things. So I guess in the cognitive algebra model, they just simply have a higher value, whichever side of the equation they're on. Or in the configural model, we're more likely to pick an early thing we learn about somebody as their core trait, that we often don't wait around a long time to figure out what somebody's core trait is. Instead, we tend to pick something that we learn about them early, and then that becomes their core trait. So again, it has the early things we learn about somebody have a disproportional impact on our overall impression of them, no matter what method we use to form that impression. What's interesting is that there's the sort of other extreme from the primacy effect called the recency effect, and that says that often the most recent things we learn about somebody are also far more influential than the things maybe in the middle. So if there are the first few things we find out about somebody, we find out lots of other things, and there's the most recent things we find out about them. And the stuff at the start and the end of the list have far more of an impact than the stuff in the middle. Consider Alex, for example. You can see all the things I told you about him at the top of the screen. Now, I put positive things both at the start and at the end of the list, and put the more negative things in the middle. So that probably biased most of you towards being more likely to like Alex than dislike him, because the first things you encountered and the most recent things you found out about him were positive. Now, another thing that we know about potential biases is that often, even when we're doing kind of cognitive algebra and weighing up the pros and cons about somebody, negative information nearly always has more weighting than positive ones. So you could almost, the cognitive algebra model implies that if there were the same number of things that we knew about somebody that were positive and negative, that it would be a draw, that we would be neutral towards them. But actually, in a one-to-one comparison, the negative stuff weighs more than the positive stuff. And as such, even if the number of items were the same, the fact that the negative ones each weigh more would mean that the overall impression we would have of that person is negative. So effectively what it tells us is that for every bad thing we learn about somebody, we often need to learn several good things, or good things of much more significance than the bad thing, in order to balance it out. It's not obvious why we do this, why we are prone to be sort of more influenced by negative information, but unfortunately we are. Or what those three facts together, sort of primacy, recency and negative information biases, tell you is that the common sort of folk belief that a negative first impression is hard to shake off is absolutely true as far as the research is concerned. A primacy negative fact to learn about somebody will take an awful lot of positive stuff to balance out before you're even neutral towards that person again. So if you weren't nervous about meeting people for the first time before now, maybe that's something you need to start getting a little bit more concerned about. The other thing that affects our judgment of people is the context, not just what we learn about them, but the context in which we learn it. So you might say that generosity is generally a positive quality, which is true. However, if we saw somebody being generous towards maybe an attractive member of the opposite sex, we might interpret that generosity differently, maybe less positively. Or at the other extreme, if we knew somebody was sort of strapped for cash, was having a tough time financially, and yet we still saw them being generous in donations to charity, that generosity would carry far more of an impact in terms of our impression of them than similar generosity by somebody who was much more wealthy or well off. So I don't know if this is a distortion, but rather that when judging people, we also take into account the context, the situation they're in terms of what we learn about them. The last thing that you should be aware of in terms of biases, in terms of our impression formation, is that we are biased towards sort of forming positive impressions of people who are physically attractive. Now, again, that shouldn't come as any massive surprise to most of you, that we tend to want to like people who are attractive to us. But it's interesting how much it has an effect on us, that generally speaking, we seem to want to believe that people who are physically attractive are also good people. And so this distorts how we interpret their behaviour, and it distorts what we remember about what they've done. I think one of the best examples of this is, as far as I'm concerned, Lady Diana Spencer, or Princess Diana as she was, who was considered to be a very attractive woman, had model good looks that were put her on the front page of magazines even after she was no longer a princess. And while I would say that she was probably a good person, I didn't know her personally, I think that her physical attractiveness meant that people were much more likely to see goodness in her because of what they call this halo effect. Now, it's interesting that I think her rival in love, Camilla Parker Bowles, almost suffered the opposite, in that because Camilla was much older, and generally speaking we find youth more attractive than age, that she got none of those kind of benefits. She wasn't given the benefit of the doubt in the same way that Diana was, and so all the sort of things that worked in Diana's favour probably seemed to have worked against Camilla. Again, I'm not saying Camilla was a bad person or a good person, but I think the fact that she wasn't perceived to be as attractive as Diana meant that she was less likely to be seen as a good person. And it's interesting that if you look at the black and white photo of Camilla when she was Diana's age, I would say that if they had been the same age, they probably wouldn't have been seen as such opposites in terms of people's opinion of them. I think Camilla's looks reasonably good looking when she was the same age as Diana, and so if she had been young as well, she might have benefited from the halo effect in the way Diana did. What this tells us effectively is that good looking people often live in a nicer world than we do, because other people not only see them as attractive but also see them as better people, as good people, and so are likely to be more positive towards them, more forgiving of their failings, which is, I guess, yet another reason for you to feel slightly miffed at anybody who's good looking and seems to be having a better time of it than you are. Now, I've said a few times at this point that negative first impressions are hard to shake, and unfortunately this is true. Both the primacy effect, that it's the first thing they learn about you, and the fact that it's negative information is likely to have a huge impact on their impression of you. But is it hopeless? If you stumble and make a bad first impression, are you doomed? Is there any way to undo the harm? Now, interestingly, very recent research by Manna Ferguson suggests that it is possible to undo a negative first impression, but that it's harder or more complex than it may appear. To begin with, it's not simply enough to, if you like, introduce lots of positive stuff after that negative first impression. That doing that on its own isn't always enough to completely undo the damage. And instead, what seems to really work in terms of undoing a negative first impression is to get the individuals to consciously reevaluate that first impression and see if you can use that conscious reevaluation to get them to reconsider how bad it was and maybe get them to see it in a positive light. Let me illustrate this with the example that Manna Ferguson used. They gave people a hypothetical scenario and said, imagine that someone in your area, we'll call him Fred, has been creeping into people's houses, has been pouring water on their electrical goods, and has been sort of grabbing their precious things and running away with them. What do you think of Fred? Not surprisingly, this description didn't exactly produce a positive response. People generally thought Fred was a creep or an unrepeatable name or a criminal, and they had a very negative impression of him. Now, after doing other things, Manna Ferguson came back to those people again and said, actually, we've learned new things about Fred. And they either told them a lot of positive things about Fred, which had nothing to do with the first things they told them. So, Fred works in a homeless shelter, Fred's very kind to his mother, Fred recycles regularly. Or they even told them that the first information they'd been told about Fred was wrong, that it was a case of mistaken identity, it hadn't been Fred that was going into people's houses in this way. And they then reevaluated the impression these people had of Fred. What was interesting is that in both of these cases, there was an improvement in their impression of Fred. They no longer saw him in such a negative way, but they still saw him negatively to a certain degree. Even learning that the first impression they'd had was based on false information didn't take away the negative taint on Fred. They still somehow didn't like him. Now that's really scary, considering that if the first thing somebody learns about you is completely untrue, the idea that even if you point out that it's untrue later on, they might still have some lingering dislike of you makes first impressions even scarier. However, there is hope, because what Mann and Ferguson found is that if they could get people to consciously reevaluate that first impression, it was possible to change it and even override it completely. The way they did this is to say, come back to the people, different people, but who'd also been told these negative things about Fred, and they said to these people, Well, actually, sorry, I may not have explained myself clearly earlier. When I said that Fred went into people's houses and poured water on their electrical goods, that's because the house was on fire and Fred was trying to put out the fire. And when I said that he grabbed precious things and ran away with them, I'm talking about their children and the animals that he's rescuing from the burning house. Now, that was enough to completely change their impression of Fred, and it went from being negative to being completely positive, with no trace of the initial negative first impression. And so what this shows us is that it is possible to radically change somebody's impression of another person, even a first impression, but that it requires not just simply adding in new information, but it requires us to get them to reevaluate what they already know, or what they think they already know, and that this is the most effective way to change an overall impression of anybody. I guess it gives us hope, but I wonder if it's always so easy to get people to reevaluate a negative first impression in a positive way. As always, I'm keen to ensure that we don't get too far away from considering the relevance of what we're talking about to education, because other than making you all very nervous about the next time you're introduced to somebody for the first time, the point of discussing these issues is to show how psychology can be used in education to help us understand what's going on and to help us even influence it in a positive way. Now, in the case of impression formation, there's a really good example of how this can work in education and how it can have a very big impact, and why understanding impression formation is then something that's important for any educator to do. The example of impression formation in education is often referred to as the Pygmalion effect, from a famous study that was conducted which gave it that name. Now, if you're not familiar with Pygmalion, it's a play by George Bernard Shaw about a central character called Professor Higgins, who believes that he can change the life outcomes of anybody by simply getting to speak in a more eloquent manner, sound more posh, basically. And he does this by getting a flower girl who's from a very what we would call now a lower socioeconomic status background, and teaching her to speak like a lady. You may have seen the film version of this, which was called My Fair Lady, with Audrey Hepburn and Rex Harrison. And the central idea behind Pygmalion is that our impression of somebody from the way they talk shapes everything we then think we know about them. And from what we've discussed already in this lecture, that's absolutely true. A first impression will shape our later impressions of the other things we find out about them. And that's what was the point of the play. Now, the reason that the researchers used this as the name of their study is that they wanted to study, look at the impact of a first impression on a teacher. And so what they did was that they, with the permission of the school and the parents, they went into a school and pretended to give an IQ test of some sort to a classroom of children. They then completely randomly, so they didn't actually carry out an IQ test and they didn't actually figure out any results, and they instead completely randomly selected half the class and labelled them as having a high IQ, and thus the other half were seen as being normal or low IQ. And they then told the teachers, they said to the teachers, all of these students on your, students on your class list, these are the high IQ students. And they then allowed the rest of the school year to go on as per usual. Now, what was interesting was that when they then looked at the educational outcomes of these students at the end of the year, the students who had been labelled as being more intelligent did better. They performed better on their assessments, and they were given more favourable ratings by their teachers. Now remember, these children had been selected at random, and yet at the end of the year they had done better in terms of their educational outcomes, and the teachers had said that they saw them as being better students. And so what this illustrated very clearly was that that first impression that the researchers had created in the teacher's mind had then shaped everything that had come afterwards, that effectively from that point onwards the teachers were more likely to see the quote-unquote intelligent students in a more positive way, and they had higher expectations of them. And so that shaped not only how they saw them, but probably how they interacted with them, and how much they maybe encouraged them. What this shows us is that as educators, our impressions, especially our first impressions of students, can have a massive impact on how we treat them. Not just our impressions of their intelligence, but our impressions of their willingness to learn, and how whether they're a positive or negative impact on the classroom, whether or not they're serious or not serious about their studies. That everything we then learn after them from that point onwards can be influenced by that first impression, either positively or negatively. We should also remember the other things that distort our impressions of people: how attractive they are, whether it's the first thing or the most recent thing we learn about them, and also how much negative information will have a much bigger impact on our impression of them than positive information. And so we need to be mindful of this, that often as educators we need to consciously reevaluate people again and again, because as the Mann and Ferguson study showed us, the only way to really change a negative first impression is to reevaluate what we think we know about them. So as educators, that's the challenge for us, not to simply try and learn more things about somebody if we get a negative first impression, but to come back to that first impression again and again, whether it's negative or positive, and reevaluate it, so that we don't get too influenced by just that first week, that first conversation, that first class, and instead give everybody a more constantly reevaluated chance to impress us, to show us what they're capable of, to make a good impression, not just the first time, but any time. Okay then, one final recap and we're done. In this second half of the session, we focused on impression formation, the way that we take small fragments, pieces of things we know about somebody, and use them to create a complete overall impression of what that person is like and what we think of them and how we're going to react to them. And there are many ways we do this. We can sometimes just weigh up the pros and cons that we know about somebody, or it may be that we instead focus in on one particular thing we know about them, and then that creates an overall impression which then causes us to interpret everything we learn about them afterwards in light of that first thing. While this is an automatic process and we couldn't completely shut it off even if we wanted to, it's still reasonably accurate most of the time. However, it's vulnerable to certain biases. The first things we learn about somebody and the most recent tend to influence us more, as well as does learning very negative things about somebody, or if they're physically attractive. All of these things can distort the impression we have of them. And as teachers, we need to be mindful of this, because our first impressions of students can then have a significant impact on how we evaluate those students from then on in, and even how the students themselves will perform, because we may treat them differently, have different expectations of them, which can then lead to the students sort of pushing themselves harder, or not so much, depending on what we expect them to achieve. Ultimately, though, it's not just in the lap of the gods. We can take sort of conscious control of the process, and we can be consciously, critically reevaluating our impression of the students we teach. That once we know that first impressions can have a disproportionate effect on us, we can revisit them and reevaluate the judgments we made of those people early on, in order to see if we feel they're still fair, and that this is probably the best way to avoid having a first impression or a negative impression have more impact on us, on our impression, on our interactions with students, than it should. Thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this, and there's some references after this point in the slides for you to have a look at if you're interested in reading up any more about some of the research that we've looked at.